Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Sandy Hanna lived in Saigon, the Paris of the Orient, as the French called it, from 1960 to 1962. She was 8 years old when her family arrived, and as she describes it, the city was a place of extreme poverty, but also great beauty, of politics and intrigue, plot and counterplot. She tells her coming-of-age story in a book from Post Hill Press called The Ignorance of Bliss, an American Kid in Saigon, and I'm very pleased to welcome her to our show now. Hi.
Thank you, Leonard.
How would you describe this book? Memoir, history? You include documents and other writings along with your own writing.
I think it's a little bit of everything. It has, I started writing this because my father had been given an expose by his Vietnamese counterpart when we lived in Saigon. And he gave it to me when he was 86 years old and said, it's time to do something. And I said, okay, Colonel. I always called him Colonel. What? He said, well, you could do an accurate documentary, and I'll tell you where everything is coming out of the Library of Congress. But my dad was a character, and I said, that just doesn't sound like you. What do you want? He says, I want a compelling story. I said, well, why? Why now? And he said, because if you don't understand history, you repeat it. We're doing that in the Middle East. So thus began the process of writing this book. But he also advised me, he said, people don't like to talk about Vietnam. So he says, you've got to find a way in which you can get them involved and then educate. So you will actually follow me. You'll take my journey with me.
We'll get to the expose later as the story unfolds. But was much of what you experienced unclear to you until you looked back on it many years later? Because you were just 8 years old.
Well,
when you
actually
arrived.
10 years old.
Well, 10 when you left.
No, 10 when I got there, 12 when I left.
Well,
so
I got that wrong.
That's okay. I think what happened was we arrived there, and it was just, it was incredible. We had a French villa. We had servants. I mean, everything was opulent. It was amazing. And so as a kid, we were unsupervised, and we were just having a ball. We were members of the French swim club. And what probably would have happened, I would have gone on in that kind of vein, except that we went to what we thought was a parade, and it turned out to be a coup against the reigning President Diem. And
you heard firecrackers and looked up, and there was a truck with a lot of people with M16s?
M1s.
M1s.
And they thought that it was a shot, so they started shooting. And they shot everyone about 3 people away from my brother. And that basically got my attention.
You're also a visual artist. How much of your artwork has drawn upon what you saw in Vietnam when you were still a kid?
Oh, very much so. My father was an amateur photographer, and so I had a lot of images to refer to that was really helpful. So it's definitely that.
You suggest that it's important to know something about Vietnamese history to understand what happened during the years before the United States entered the picture. And so I've thought about it a bit. China ruled it for over 1,000 years, and then Vietnam was a kind of independent state for another 1,000 years, and then the French took it over as part of what they called Indochina. When did the country become a French colony?
It had been, before World War II, a French colony for many, many years, and the problem for the Vietnamese was they had been fighting the Chinese for 2,000 years, trying to become a nation, an independent country. Even Ho Chi Minh had written letters to Truman saying it's the same as what you went through in America, trying to get away from the British. But Truman didn't read the letters. And so when World War II was over,
Well, the Japanese took it over during the war.
Japanese took it over, but Ho Chi Minh fought with his Viet Minh alongside of Americans to get rid of the Japanese. And the Japanese had basically given them independence during that time. They just wanted the port cities. So they really, the biggest problem was when the war was over, they asked the Allies, what do you want? And France said, well, we want Vietnam back and we want Algeria. So now we start with Indochina War II. It starts up again because they're still trying to get themselves removed from France.
Wasn't this part of the Geneva Accord, what happened in Vietnam?
What
was agreed to there?
Well, the Geneva Accord basically took the country, divided it at the 17th parallel. And basically, Ho Chi Minh was to rule the north. They were going to put Emperor Bo Dai in the south, but he just wanted to be in Paris as a playboy. So they brought in Diem, who had no connections other than 3 very poor brothers that lived in the south.
Wasn't there also a fixed vote?
It was supposed to be that this was 54 to 56.
A plebiscite that was determined what the future of Vietnam was. But this is after Dien Bien Phu and the French
Right.
had experienced any number of humiliating defeats in trying to hold on to Vietnam.
Yeah, Dien Bien Phu, I think, was the deciding factor. And, of course, we were coming out of World War II as Americans, and we were very assuming we could do better than the French and there would be no problem. We could just get in there and clean this up. Well, when the Geneva Accord was signed, we agreed that there would be elections for the country and that there would be peace between 54 and 56, so that the elections would happen in 56. The country would decide. However, Diem held his own election. He counted more people than were in the entire country, and he made himself the president, and he ended up creating the Republic of South Vietnam. And we as Americans violated our own accord to support him.
That's during the Eisenhower administration?
Yes.
Why do I think Richard Nixon played a role in some of this?
That was later.
So, and you note that in 1960, most people in the United States had never heard of Vietnam?
Most hadn't. Even my father's globe, it said Indochina when he spun it to tell us where we were going. But most people had not heard of it, and I think that the country at that time, they were really excited about the Americans coming in to help them. They felt, and that changed pretty quickly.
You described that scene where your father gathered the family by the globe, spun it, let his finger track to where you would be going. Where were you living at the time?
At the time, they had sent him to the University of Chicago for a master's in something that I would think related to his new position as chief of ordnance in South Vietnam. But we were living in Hinsdale, Illinois.
And your father was assigned to Vietnam. Now, the United States wasn't involved in the fighting. What were American military people doing in Vietnam at that time?
At that point in time, we were advisors. They were sent there to help train the South Vietnamese. My dad was chief of ordnance, so his job was to set up the depots, to train them on inventory systems, to refit Japanese munition plants, whatever came along. He was pretty talented. He had been Patton's ordnance officer and also worked on the design of the Sherman tank for World War II. So he had a lot of experience, and that's what they put to use.
And this was before the United States entered what's now called the Vietnam War, but it was a time of the Red Scare and people discussing things like the domino theory. Did Vietnam fit into all of that?
Not really, because, one of the sayings is you need to understand history so you don't repeat it. And the country wasn't necessarily communist. I mean, Ho Chi Minh had gone everywhere. He'd studied democracy. He'd lived in America. He'd gone everywhere. He was trying to put together something that would work for his nation building. And the biggest problem was that they were being put into this assumption. We had McCarthy basically saying, "Oh, if Vietnam goes, all of the
the domino theory."
Exactly, and that wasn't what was going on with them. They were just trying to get out from being a colonial rule.
So, did we to some degree drive Ho Chi Minh into the arms of his communist neighbors?
I think so, because basically we came in at some point with so much firepower during the war that they really had no option but to align themselves with somebody that could help them fight us. We had this amazing thing where we didn't know how to even calibrate what we were doing, so they started having body count. But nobody could tell the difference between a peasant in a black pajama outfit and someone who was part of the Viet Cong. Most of them at the time were Viet Minh, which was just, they were trying to build their nation. But then it got changed into that, and the communist powers were able to stay in and get more powerful.
Your father was part of the military advisory aid group called MAG, M-A-A-G.
Mm-hmm.
How many other people were there with him?
Oh, there weren't that many. I think, I know for the dependent children, the military kids, the brats, there were only a few hundred of us. And I would say there were, if there was 100, 200, I would think it was quite low at that time.
When you say the brats, we know about military brats, but can it stand for any number of different things?
Well, I think most people think of lowercase B-R-A-T, we're brats, but brats stands for British Regiment Attached Transfers. So we're not called children or kids, we're called dependents.
But why British?
Because I think that was in the beginning. It became brats for, the British Army, and it's carried on. And we're a very unusual group. Like when we meet, we recognize each other immediately.
And you call yourselves the Saigon Kids.
We're the Saigon Kids, and we're finding each other. It's funny. We're just starting to really reconnect and find each other. We have a website, and we've had some reunions, and different times for different people. I was in an earlier group. But most of them stayed through 1965, at which point they were evacuated out before the war.
You describe a life of school, dance parties, movies at the concrete bunker that served as an underground theater. And weren't you a member of a Girl Scout troop that met in a cleared-out minefield?
Yes. My mother was determined that we would have all things American, so she was going to get us into Girl Scouts and my brother into Boy Scouts. And for some reason, I really do believe the ladies were having too many gin and tonics at lunchtime. They got the general to agree to give us an Army bus and take us with a small squad of military to an area that had been cleaned out, that had been a minefield. We definitely thought they were out of their minds.
This is an attempt to kind of create home there, but that means that an awful lot of the American military people were bringing their families with them.
At that time, yes, you were allowed. You had a shorter tour of duty. If you didn't bring your family, you were 14 months post. But if you brought your family, it was a 2-year stay.
Which is what your father had.
Yes.
And the children's parents were part of the military, the CIA, the USAID, the State Department, private contractors, all kind of seeing themselves as Americans in exile?
Well, I don't know if we saw ourselves in exile as much as we saw ourselves at that time. We thought we were there to represent America and to be supportive of a government.
Was there any interaction with Vietnamese kids?
Yes, some of the Vietnamese were part of our school. They joined it. They wanted to get to know Americans. But there was a lot going on at the time with Jim's brother, New, whose wife was known as the Dragon Woman, Madame New. And he had basically decided that any Vietnamese having anything to do with Americans would go in his black book. And he had spies. He had a network of spies. And, they were talking about how they had the Viet Cong in the prisons, but in fact they were the teachers. They were the Vietnamese who associated with Americans. Even my father's counterpart was imprisoned.
So that's why the Vietnamese didn't join the swim club, for example.
No, they didn't. The only Vietnamese that were part of the swim...
They were afraid that spies would somehow link them to the Americans?
Yes. They had a plan, the Jims. They were hoping to get the Americans out in a couple of years. I don't know where they came up with that idea, but they were working very hard. They were not pro-American. We supported a regime that was not pro-American.
it's hard to understand that now because obviously they were having a hard time doing it by themselves. And from your book and other things that I've read, I know there was a lot of corruption. There were a lot of people playing both sides against both ends against the middle. Is that the cliche? But anyway, it could be it could be quite complicated trying to figure out what was going on.
I think they wanted the Americans' financial support because they'd lost the French financial support, but they didn't want the Americans to have any say. There's stories where Jim had this. His brother had a philosophy called personalism, and he would pontificate when anyone from an ambassador or a State Department person came to talk to either himself or his brother, and he would just go on and on until they fell asleep. They wouldn't take any instruction.
I'm speaking with Sandy Hanna, Hanna. Her book, The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon. You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI, New York, 99.5 FM. Who was the president when your father went? Was it still Eisenhower, or had Kennedy already become president?
It was Eisenhower. Kennedy came in 62, and actually we listened to it on overseas radio, the election. But Eisenhower is the one that was part of all of that and part of the settling of the Geneva Accord.
And how do you have any sense? Obviously, you were a kid at the time, but do you have any sense of how American politics of the time, what role it played in what was going on with the Americans in Vietnam?
In the beginning, I don't think it was so much politics, but it changed. What you had was your ambassador was a State Department person. Then they changed it, and it made it a politician. And so things started to really shift. We had one point where Johnson came to visit, who was vice president at that time. And, a true sign of how the Vietnamese felt was they had to build a platform for him behind the Cirque Sportif, the swim club. But they built it over a pile of manure. And the only people that knew that it was over this pile of manure were the kids. So we were just hysterical thinking this was funny. But
they did it for symbolic reasons?
Symbolic. Everything was symbolic. Even the Tet Offensive was symbolic because the Tet was a celebration in which it was the time to come home. The ancestors, the relatives, everybody was to come home. And it's a celebration. And most of the conflicts in the early days occurred around the Tet holiday.
You have been describing a kind of an American enclave, but you mentioned that you were assigned a whitewashed stucco house that was kind of a French-style villa, and you say, we became the French, living in their villas, speaking their language, using their sports clubs, and looking just like them. And you suggest also living a life of French decadence?
Yes.
Did you at least have good food?
We had French food because the servants that had served them were now serving us. And I would have liked to have had more, exposure to the Vietnamese food, but that's what they would cook. They thought that's what we would eat. And we were. Vietnamese was a very hard language for me as a kid because it's tonal. Like our word oh. It means something different. And every word had a different intonation. So most of the time I was insulting people. So I learned French. That was the way I got by. And they all knew French. So English was not actually a language that they had at their beck and call.
It's interesting that there are any number of Asian languages where you can embarrass yourself by saying the right words but with the wrong intonation. Cantonese, a perfect example.
Yes.
If you say "le homa," everybody knows what you mean. But if you say "le homa," they have no idea what you just said.
Right. Well, this was the problem for most Americans, and French seemed to come pretty easily for us, and we picked that up quite fast.
Weren't there already coups and bombings happening?
Well, this was what was interesting. Jim really, really was not liked by the people. He was corrupt. His family was corrupt. And they were doing a lot to the countryside by, taking too large a portion of the rice. Anybody who was in his good graces was either a family or a loyalist. And everyone else they weren't getting the promotions, they weren't getting whatever. And a lot of the countryside was having to come to the city because they were starving. So the first coup was when we were there in 1960. We hadn't been there but a few weeks, and it was the Army, and that's the one we referred to earlier, where they, we think as kids that a parade on a military base is tanks and guns and soldiers, and so we were so excited about seeing this, stream of military headed towards the palace. But it turned out it was an Army coup against Diem, and the only thing that saved him was they did not block one roadway and one group of the military that he had coming from the north, and that he stalled for time, and by the time they got there, then he was able to regain the position. And then, of course, the next year, in 1961, the Air Force decided that they were going to so they flew over to bomb. Now, we had been on our bus going to school. Suddenly our bus driver turns around, heads back at full speed, drops us at our house, and we had a roof garden. So we got up on top and we just watched the bombing, not knowing if our mother or father were there, because my mother had started a kindergarten near the palace. And my father, being in charge of ordnance, would have been the person that they sent over. In fact, they did send him over to defuse the bomb that landed and didn't go off above the whole Diem and New family.
It was dropped from an American plane.
Yes, they were using American planes, and there were two of them that just shot down the main road there and kept coming around and bombing.
So your father and his crew went there and defused it. The bombs hadn't exploded.
They hadn't exploded, and my father was to tell us a tale later that night. Was they got in and they took the fuse out and he threw it into the back of the Jeep, and he arranged for the bomb itself to be removed. He said, though, he got in the Jeep, and as they were starting to leave, the timer went off, and he said, "Oh, my God." Had no idea.
Now, Diem was unpopular, but would people have wanted Ho Chi Minh, or would they have wanted some other South Vietnamese person as their leader?
I think they would have wanted Ho Chi Minh because they saw him as a nationalist. They didn't see him as a communist at the time, and also he was of and for the people. And what happened with the communists, they took advantage of that in the sense that what they would do is then go to the villages and basically teach them to pool their resources, pool their grain so they weren't starving, and not take a position of control, but one of helping and in a socialist manner to help the people who were really suffering from what was going on with that particular regime.
Was this the subject of dinner talk?
What was the subject of dinner talk was usually my dad kind of ranting and raving about somebody that he was having trouble with because of this craziness within the administration, or he'd be reading something to us that, for example, after the first coup. And we didn't tell him that we had been there. We had gone there as children, and then, if we had a saying, if they did not ask, we did not tell. And so when they found us under the bed, having been there all day waiting for them, they just said, "Get out from underneath." And we didn't tell because they didn't ask. But that night, or maybe it was the next night, he came home with a letter that had been written by a general saying, Jim would like you all to come home. Please join the family again. All is forgiven. And my father was just beside himself with this.
Now, you weren't consciously spying in that case, but you did wind up spying.
Yes, I considered myself a brat and a spy. And I started spying on my dad when I was 8, when we were in the States, because I came across his collection of World War II photos. And I wasn't supposed to be there.
That's photos of a concentration camp when he was with Patton's Third Army?
Right. He'd been in it. He'd basically developed the film, but he did not print it. So he was starting to print strips to see what was there. And I was so curious because he'd go into this room and this red light would come out from underneath. And I finally, on one day, saw an opportunity to go see what was in the room. Went in the room, and it happened to be the day he was printing the strips from the concentration camps. And I couldn't ask because I wasn't supposed to be there. So I decided that I needed to spy on my father because I didn't know him. And I happened to be in the Brownies at that time, and I thought that was a really good uniform. So whenever I thought it was, a good day to spy, I would get into this Brownie uniform. And my mother would say, "It's not a Brownie day, Sandy."
Your mother knew what you were doing?
She didn't know what I was doing. She just was completely confused as to why I was in the Brownie outfit. So I continued it in Vietnam.
And you did that, you did your stakeout on the stairway.
Yes, because I could hear when people would come at night, usually. And we would have been probably gone to bed already, but I could hear when there were people, and I would attempt to slide down the steps and get my position. And so in a sense, all of the things that my father told me later and gave me on the expose, I really had overheard and I'd witnessed, but it wasn't until he was 86 and we went through the whole thing that it all suddenly came together for me.
You spied on your father and his Vietnamese counterpart, Colonel Lee Van Sam, who made late-night visits. Again, they made those visits because they wanted to be circumspect?
Well, what happened was, and what started it, was Colonel Sam's wife, who was a cousin of Madame New, had been up in Dalat, and she'd been there for holiday with her 5 children, and she happened to see Madame New and Vietnamese General Don going into Madame New's boudoir. Madame New saw her. She saw Madame New. She immediately got her kids packed up, went back to Saigon, found her husband and said, "This is what I saw." He was terrified. So he wrote out an expose on every single person that was part of the Diem regime, showed up in the night with it to give my father because he thought he was going to either be assassinated or imprisoned. And sure enough, later, he wasn't that many weeks later, he was imprisoned.
And was released with the help of your father, but removed from the military.
Not the first time. What happened was they let him out, but they took away his position as chief of ordnance for the South Vietnamese Army. And he ended up, having about a year where he was still working with my dad, but he was no longer in a position of control. And he would come to complain about how people who were being trained by the American military weren't being promoted. So it was only the loyalists and only the family, and it was just completely out of control. But about a year later, he was basically told, you stay at home, you're no longer part of the military.
So it sounds to me like your lives were in constant state of intrigue. He feared retribution from Madame New and asked your father to hold the documents in case something happened to him or his family.
Yes. And my dad used part of that to get him out. He was accused of stealing from the depots. So my dad had every single depot in South Vietnam inventoried, and in fact they had more things in there than they had on the inventory.
Now, do we know whether Madame New was having affairs outside of her marriage?
Oh, yes, most certainly. She was quite a bit younger than New. In fact, there was a rumor that New had been involved with her mother. And so it was a surprise when she chose New of everyone else, because I think he was in his 40s and she was, I don't even know if she was 20 yet. But she chose him. And that was fairly well known. There was a lot of intrigue around Madame New.
You say the expose also proved the anti-American sentiment that pervaded the Diem regime.
Yes, that's exactly what Colonel Sam was trying to show, was that, and also because he had...
This is beyond Madame New's indiscretion.
Yes, it was beyond Madame New's indiscretion, but in the expose, what he was able to do was show who was loyal to who got what position, what their attitudes were towards the Americans, and also because of having been close to the News and Diems because of his wife being the cousin of Madame New, he also knew their thinking and what they had said about their idea of how long they planned to put up with the Americans and what their plans were.
And what were their feelings that the Americans were going to meddle in their politics? I mean, we were.
Well, of course we were. That's why they weren't giving access. And of course, Washington was completely frustrated because they couldn't get a handle or a hold on this particular regime. They would just avoid it at every point.
Well, there's been a lot of debate over the years whether Kennedy actually planned to get the United States engaged militarily in Vietnam or not. This is the period where all of that waffling was occurring.
Yes, but he had also written, about 2 weeks before he was assassinated, he wrote a memo basically directing the beginning of the withdrawal of Americans. What had happened was, because of this paranoia about, the Red Scare and the domino and McCarthy, anybody who knew anything about an Asian country was taken out of any position of knowledge. So
the China hands.
Yeah, so there was a void in Washington of even understanding this country. Well, Kennedy put somebody in there and said, what is this Vietnam thing? What is it? And when he learned what the country was about and what was going on, he drafted this memo. And he said, I think we need to start taking people out. 2 weeks later, he was assassinated. And one day after his funeral, Johnson wrote a counter memo saying we're going to escalate.
We are back with Sandy Hanna, whose book, part memoir, part history, part, I don't know, what else, reminiscence.
Adventure.
Is called The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon. It's published by Post Hill Press, has some wonderful illustrations as well, photographs from the time that really give us a sense of what was going on there that we could not have otherwise. As you mentioned earlier, Americans weren't really all that aware of Vietnam, other than it was a place where we were starting to get more and more involved.
Yes,
I remember even in the early '60s, there was a fear that if you were drafted into the Army, there was a chance you might be sent to Vietnam.
Yes, during the early part, from 56 to, 63 probably, more and more Americans were coming in various positions. How we knew that it was building up was basically our choices of things at the postal exchange and what we could buy.
What kinds of movies were you watching?
We watched everything. This was one of the places my mother sent us because she would know we were there. So we would end up in front of the postal exchange. We'd get on an Army transport. It would take us to the front of a storefront that had a metal grill that was partially opened. And you'd go in there, and then you'd go downstairs into what was basically a bomb shelter that had been made into a theater. They always had a USO show, so there was always this, woman in scantily clad with a baton, and she always dropped it. And I just imagine her horror, because we were always in the front row going, just wait, it's coming, she's going to drop it, And of course the older kids would get up in the balcony.
You weren't allowed in the balcony.
Well, my brother wouldn't let me up in the balcony. That was where the cool kids were, and I was in charge of the younger kids, so I had to sit up front. But we would see everything, whatever got sent to Vietnam. But the problem was, if they sent a movie and the general was on reconnaissance, it had to be shown in the general's library first, and then it would come to us at the bomb shelter. And so sometimes we'd see the same movie over and over again. And, of course, my mother didn't care whether we'd seen it or not. She just knew where we were. And I happened to see The World of Susie Wong 21 times.
Oh.
Yeah, you can just play the music and I can tell you the movie's on.
Weren't there a number of attempts made to discredit your father and remove him from his position as Chief of Ordnance Corps? There
was, yes. When it became political, and my dad was military, and also there were a lot of subcontractors, military subcontractors who wanted to get a position there, wanted to get a foothold in. And so there was one particular man who basically wrote up a negative report saying my father didn't know what he was doing, which is crazy because that's what he did for Patton and what he had been doing in South Vietnam. But they made short stay of him because my dad's boss knew different. But it had been a contractor trying to discredit my dad so they could get in and get control of the ordnance.
We recently had someone on our show who was in military intelligence, and he was frustrated by all of the complicated situations in Vietnam. But when he came back to the United States, that's when he finally was listened to about all the problems. They weren't listening to him when he was there.
No, they didn't listen to my father either. And he actually, at one point, took the expose to Washington to try to make them aware of the fact that this was not a pro-American regime. And
this is when Lyndon Johnson was already president.
This was when, let's see, it was before Kennedy. So it was.
So was it Eisenhower?
Yes, it was between Eisenhower and Kennedy. I'm not sure quite when he did it, but he did do that. And they told, and he also was, at the time, he was trying to protect Colonel Sam. And they said nothing's going to be done about Sam because they wouldn't help him get him back as chief of ordnance in South Vietnam. But they basically didn't do a thing, so it was kind of a wasted trip for him.
Were you, to some degree, unsupervised? How much freedom did you have as a 10 and 11-year-old in this foreign city where there could be a bombing on the next corner?
I'm not sure why, but we were completely on our own as far as what we wanted to do. One thing about brats is we will survive no matter what, and we will also make the place we're at interesting for ourselves. And so we weren't. We'd walk outside the villa, hail down a motorcyclo or a cyclo and head to wherever we wanted to go. We just had to be back by night. And that was how it started. And then as the coups began and things became a little more difficult. It wasn't until there was a missionary family that was kidnapped up country that they started to rein us in.
You and your 13-year-old brother Tom ran a baby powder and Hershey bar business in the black market. Yes.
I had a dream. I thought I could go to the Olympics, and I needed a horse. I didn't know how to ride, but I had this strong desire to have some money. And it happened that it was when we had watched, when I was on my 21st viewing of The World of Susie Wong, that I looked back in the movie theater and realized that my brother wasn't there. And as we got into the bus to be turned to the postal exchange, I saw him running, and he was running from where the black market was, and he got to the circle. Now, the circle had all this traffic, and one of the things you learned as a kid was how to cross a circle, and that was you zinned your way across. You kind of stood there, got calm, took a step out, you didn't look right, you didn't look left, you didn't change your pace, or you would die. So pretty much that's it. So he was running, stopped to zin his way across, and then flew in as the doors were closing on the bus. And I knew I had him. I knew that he was doing something and that I could blackmail him. I was a horrible sister. So I said, listen, I'll tell. And he said, well, no, you always tell anyway. I said, but whatever you're doing, if you let me be part of it, I won't tell because then I'll get in trouble. And he's like, well, what are you going to do with the younger kids? I said, I'll tell them we're going to sell them. And they'll be afraid of us, and they'll go in on their own.
You were the two oldest. He was the oldest, and then you were the oldest girl.
Right, and my sister was 8, and my little brother was 5. So they were very, very concerned about us because we threatened them all the time. So it turned out that he had been going and basically, picking up stuff at the postal exchange and then going out on the black market and selling it. And then whatever money he had, he was going to the bar and the pool halls and drinking ba and he
was 13 years old.
Yeah. And so he let his little sister, the 10-year-old, he decided that this was good because we could carry more contraband with us and that he could leave me and I would become the main seller. So he had a Coke crate and he had a mat that he'd worked out a deal that he could store it behind one of the stalls and kind of pay rent to the guy that was there. I'm sure he didn't own the spot, but it was a little dirt floor, and we'd roll it out and set up the baby powder and Hershey bars. And then he'd say, make money, and he'd leave. And he'd leave me there, and I would be surrounded, because one of the things Vietnamese were always trying to see is if you felt different. Was your skin different? Was your hair different? So you were always being petted and touched. And I would put the baby powder on and say that's what it does it, So that's sold. And, of course, the Hershey bars, no problem. They tasted good. And I'd make little sample plates.
I was wondering about why those two products. I understood that the chocolate bars are popular all over the world.
Well, the baby powder was that, and it worked. And also, I'm sure I had some buyers that were going to just mix it with cocaine.
So you had people supplying you with baby powder?
Well, the Postal Exchange, which was where you go, the PX, all these American products were there. And we had our military passes so we could go in. And before we got on the bus, all four of us kids would buy up pretty much everything.
And how long did that last?
Oh, I ran it for 2 years. I had thousands of dollars by the time it was time to come home.
Were you sorry when you had to come home?
I don't think military kids have that within their perspective. We are told a week before we're going to leave, we're leaving, and we leave. We leave our friends, our teachers, our pets. We don't look back. My mom would say, would you want to take the thing that you had before, or do you want something new? You were allowed to take one thing. And the rest got given to the kids out on the street or whatever she did with it. So you just left. There wasn't a sadness or anything. It was just the way our lives had been and always would be.
Did you feel that you had a real sense of what Vietnam was like, or were you living in something of a bubble?
I think I would have been in a bubble if I didn't have my black market. Mm-hmm. And if the daughter of our cook, Tiba, who was named Lucy, hadn't decided that she would educate me whether I liked it or not, because I would bring, the paper, the Stars and Stripes, and they were doing body count, and, it had like headlines underneath or what Washington was saying, and I was trying to do social studies reports, and she would look at it and then take me aside and say, here is what's going on. Here's what you need to know, little sister. She always called me little sister. So I was always kind of under her auspices to figure it out and get smart.
So you had education from both sides.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that what you were being taught by the American teachers was quite different from what you learned from the Vietnamese teachers. Very,
very different. Though the teacher we had for the 6th grade, which was when I was 12, she really tried. She had us reading about some of the history of Vietnam, so that we were getting exposed to the fact that the country had been fighting for independence for so long. So she tried. She tried to bridge the gap.
To some degree, Vietnam's problem is its location. It's surrounded by rather aggressive countries, especially China, but others, and just not far off of its shore was Japan.
Well, there's a wonderful quote from one of the emperors, 18th century emperors, said, the Vietnamese are not a reliable group. You conquer them and they shortly throw you out. So the Vietnamese were known as vicious warriors. They were known to always throw out whoever tried to take them. So the surrounding countries pretty much, knew that about Vietnam.
What about religion? Because any number of people converted to Catholicism when the French had it as a colony, but there was still wasn't the majority still Buddhist?
Majority was Buddhist, and Jim was Catholic, and so his supporters were Catholic, most of them. But Buddhism was a beautiful, beautiful belief system, and it was so much what the Vietnamese were about. They believed in the will of heaven. So a lot of people say, well, they're afraid to go back to Vietnam because they feel guilty. They feel there'll be some, consequence of what we were doing. But you'll be embraced because in their belief, it wasn't you and it wasn't me. It was the will of heaven that caused these things to occur. And also Ho Chi Minh said, do not blame the American people. It is the government. And so they're a wonderful, warm, and interesting group that have a very strong base in Buddhism.
A strong sense of fate.
Strong sense of fate, and that it is the will of heaven.
Have any of the Saigon kids who you've remained in contact with gone back?
Yes, several have gone. And in fact, I was supposed to go this year in November. I was going to be on a build project south of Saigon for a school. But the book was going to be coming out at that time, so I had to change plans. But those that have gone have loved it and felt welcomed. In fact, there was one girl said she found her old house, her villa that she lived in, and she was standing out front crying because for her it was sad. You know, you left so much of what you loved. And an old woman came up and put her arm around her and said, no, not you, not me. Okay, no cry.
But Saigon is no longer the major city at that time. Well, it's all Ho Chi Minh City, isn't it?
It's Ho Chi
the
Minh
capital in the north.
Yes.
So what's happened to Saigon in the years following?
I think Saigon has held on to a lot of what made it unique. It's not as kind of sparse and controlled as North and Hanoi. And so it's much more oriented towards tourism, and it's much, it's got a different kind of attitude. So I think they're two different places, but you'll notice the difference when you're there.
And I'm assuming a lot of tourists are Americans and who had fought, or the families of Americans who fought in Vietnam, who go back to see what it's like. So there's foreign exchange.
Yes, and I encourage veterans or family members who didn't understand Vietnam, I encourage them to go to Vietnam. There'll be and a lot of military have started going back, and I think it's a relief. It's a burden that is taken off of them because there is such a welcoming and warm feeling.
You left because your father's tour of duty was over.
Yes.
It was a fortuitous time to leave because all hell broke loose in the years that followed. Yes.
In fact, the military-dependent kids that were there were evacuated out in 1965. And, they were told they were going to school that day, and they said, you might be leaving, you might not be leaving, so take one thing with you that you might want to take with you. One little girl was told she was going to the beach. So she took her swimsuit and a pail and ended up on a transport with these things. Another girl said, I was so upset because I was leaving my pet dog, Inky, and my pet turkeys. So I wrote, and this was on our Saigon Kid website, I said, okay, the 2-year-old dog, brown with tiger stripes, most loyal animal you've ever known, came with a maid named Hanna, and you lived in Chalon. And she went, yes. I said, you had my dog.
You had to leave that dog.
I had to leave my monkey, my dog, my elephant, my turkeys, my stork. Everything would be brought to us as these. The only thing that the Vietnamese didn't eat was a male cricket. And you can tell it from the wrinkles on its back, and because it sang. So you'd always see the children with a little bamboo cage with a cricket in it. But everything else got eaten.
You could eat a female cricket.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm. And so they would bring these gifts to my father, and I, of course, rescued them and wouldn't allow them to be eaten.
So you left. You must have been much more interested in what was going on there than most of the other American kids you are now spending time with.
I think that I completely had no idea what civilians were about. We came back pretty much still wearing our Vietnamese tailored clothing. We spoke another language. We'd just gone through coups. We were coming from a country where it was just the politics was crazy. And then we land.
Politics here were getting a bit crazy as well.
Yeah, and when we first came back, we ended up in Fort Monroe, Virginia, right at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we left one place only to be in a hotbed of another place. And my feeling was, well, okay, so they're going to kill us. One way or another, we're going to get killed. So I ended up being a very angry teenager because I just thought everything was so idiotic. And then when my father was going to be sent back to Vietnam, he resigned. He was a career officer, but he resigned because he didn't believe that we should be there. Actually, all of the majority of the advisors, even General McGarr, who was in charge at the time, said, don't escalate. It's a civil matter. We shouldn't be here doing this. So Washington knew what the situation was. They chose not to go with what they knew.
Well, they also were demanding of later people their positive reports, even though some pretty awful stuff was happening.
Oh, yeah.
What happened to the DM regime?
Well, in 2 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated, another military coup occurred. And this time we kind of said, America said, well, we won't interfere, which meant you can do whatever you want. So at that point, that particular branch of the military in South Vietnam basically got hold of the two of them. I think they bombed the palace again. They actually, Jim had stopped using his own military. He was using palace guards primarily for their protection and for any conflict. And so they caught the brothers who had escaped and gone to Chalon. They found them there, put them in a transport and assassinated them.
Were you surprised that the whole thing dragged on until 1975?
I wasn't, because of no president wanted to be the one to say it wasn't worth it. I wasn't surprised because they still believed that, even Nixon was saying, well, we'll just bomb them, we'll just bomb the country to bits. We still had that arrogance, that ugly American arrogance that said, this is a country of peasants, and we're stronger, we can overrun, They didn't understand why it wasn't working, because they didn't understand the country, the people, the history, and they kept going with the same idea. And like I said, if you don't understand Vietnam, you're going to continue to do it, and we are doing that in the Middle East.
Well, it wasn't a country of just one people. If you went into the mountains, you had the Montagnards. They were a whole different ethnic group.
They were, and my father used to go up there because they were very supportive of the Americans.
A number of different languages spoken as well in the country.
Yes, depending on where you were, there were different accents. But the mountain people were very, very, in fact, they were being used as guides by the advisors when they were there, and I'm sure military after that.
Have I left anything out in this conversation, or were there other things, anything else that you really feel it's important for us to know?
Well, I think that it's important for people to understand what was going on prior to us becoming so mistakenly involved. I feel for every single family that lost anyone there. I have lots of friends who passed there. But I also think it's important, too, to understand military families and what they're like. And what I say, we're the most unrecognized kind of group. There's 15 million adult brats in this country. That's not counting overseas or in this country. And I'm sure most people have run into one. You can always tell one by just ask the question, where are you from? And there will be a pause. Mm-hmm. And that's when you know you got a brat.
Because they've lived in so many different places.
Yeah, you have to think.
As their parents moved around, well, the father usually moved around the military.
Right, and they don't know quite what to answer because they're not sure what your question really is. So in writing the book, I really hoped that I would give people an idea of what was going on, but also to understand, and you really follow me. You're with me on my journey as a 10-year-old in this, and it's quite an adventure. I think it's enjoyable, and it's also educational.
Did it force you to grow up a lot sooner? Because most 10-year-olds, they think they know a lot, but they weren't seeing coups and spies and having to learn about secret liaisons and all sorts of other things. Did you really understand what all of that was about?
I think so. I mean, on some level, I think I understood it much better when my dad and I sat down with the expose. But I mean, I knew.
But that was many years later.
Many years later. But at the time, we knew, and we were in some ways told, and we were included by my father in what was going on. He was trying to make sure we paid attention, and jump out of a cyclo if he won't go à droite or à gauche. So I would say yes. We definitely felt we knew a great deal of what was going on.
And the significance of your title, The Ignorance of Bliss?
I feel as though we as children, and actually in those early days, we were blissful. We were living this amazing life, and we had such freedom that we would never, ever have again. I mean, the older kids were like just wild. And so the ignorance part is that we didn't really understand the country and what was going on. In the beginning, we were blissful, and I think that is important for people to recognize.
Can you ever look at baby powder or a Hershey bar in the same way?
I'll tell you, I can't.
The Ignorance of Bliss is Sandy Hanna's book, published by Post Hill Press. It's been such a great pleasure having you on our show.
Oh, thank you.
It was fun to read the book.
I know. People are telling me they start and they can't put it down. They cancel their work. They so I think it's a good read, and I'm glad you enjoyed it, Leonard.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.